The last time he'd been to town, they'd thrown pebbles at his boots. Not rocks, nothing to cause real injury, just the kind of small, sharp stones that communicate contempt. He stood before the mercantile, his hands empty, the leather of his palms cracked from digging. Inside, Sheriff Brody watched from behind the gleaming glass, his arms crossed, a silent judgment that was louder than any shout. The store owner, a man whose children Corbin had once helped pull from a flash flood, shook his head. No credit. Not for the panes of glass, not for the sacks of lime, and certainly not for the strange, foreign seeds Corbin had requested by special order. He was the townsfool, a ghost haunted by grief, digging his own grave out on the lonely expanse where his wife, Martha, had been laid to rest. He was the tunnel rat. The nickname had stuck like mud, a heavy, suffocating brand. A group of young men, emboldened by the sheriff's silent approval, laughed as he turned to leave. One of them called out, a jeer that cut through the cold air, "Digging to China, Corbin?" He didn't answer. He just pulled the collar of his worn coat tighter and walked away, the weight of their scorn a physical burden. He remembered his own words, spoken quietly to the sheriff a week prior, a warning that had been dismissed with a wave of the hand. "Nature keeps its own ledger, Sheriff," he'd said, his voice low. "And the bill always comes due." The sheriff had just stared at him, his expression a mixture of pity and annoyance, as if Corbin were a stray dog whining at the door. As he walked the long miles back to his ranch, he felt the first flakes of snow, sharp and crystalline, land on his weathered face. They were early. Too early. And in their cold sting, he felt the chilling confirmation of a truth the town had chosen to ignore. The ledger was open. And the first entry was being written in white across the hard, unforgiving land. The digging had started not out of madness, but out of memory. The winter before had been a sharp one, a bitter taste of what was possible, and it had killed the small apple orchard he and Martha had so lovingly planted. The trees, their branches black and skeletal against the snow, had been a monument to his failure to protect the one living thing he had left of her. Martha had loved fruit. She spoke of it like a kind of magic, a burst of summer sunshine you could hold in your hand on the darkest day of the year. She'd had a book, its pages thin and brittle, filled with drawings of old-world wonders. One drawing had captivated him, a sunken garden, a pit dug into the earth in a cold country, lined with stone and covered with glass, where green things grew while the world outside was frozen white. After she was gone, the silence in their small ranch house was a living thing. It was in the empty chair, the unused teacup, the scent of lavender that no longer clung to her pillow. He found the book one day, lying open to that page. And in the depths of his sorrow, an idea took root, a desperate, stubborn seed of a plan. He wasn't digging a grave, he was trying to build a memory. He was trying to cultivate the one thing that felt like her, a pocket of impossible warmth in a world that had grown unbearably cold. He started by studying the land, not as a rancher looking for good grazing, but as an engineer. He found a long, south-facing hill of dense clay and shale, a natural barrier against the northern winds. It would be hard digging, but it would be stable. It would hold. He spent weeks just watching the sun, tracking its low arc across the winter sky, marking the precise angles with sticks and stones, calculating where the light would fall, and for how long. The town saw a grieving man losing his mind. They saw a fool scrabbling in the dirt. They did not see the meticulous planning, the careful measurements, the desperate, loving logic that drove him deeper and deeper into the earth. The work was a kind of prayer, each swing of the pickaxe a word, each shovelful of earth a sentence. He worked from before the sun crested the eastern hills until long after it had bled out across the western plains. His hands, once skilled with reins and rope, became instruments of excavation. Blisters formed, broke, and hardened into thick calluses. The muscles in his back and shoulders coiled into dense knots of iron. The first few feet were topsoil, rich and dark, but then he hit the clay, a thick, stubborn layer that clung to his shovel and fought his every effort. Below that came the shale, which shattered into sharp, unforgiving flakes that sliced at his boots and hands. He built a ramp and used a heavy wheelbarrow, its iron wheel groaning in protest, to haul the earth out into the open, creating a mound that grew larger with each passing day. This mound was what the townsfolk saw when they rode by, a strange, ever-growing scar on the landscape. It became the primary evidence in the case against his sanity. They didn't see the inside. They didn't see the tunnel slowly taking shape, its wall smoothed by the flat of his spade, its ceiling a perfect, gentle arch. He learned the language of the earth, the soft crumble that warned of a pocket of loose soil, the sharp ring of the pick against a hidden boulder that would take days to break apart or dig around. He worked in silence, the only sounds the rhythmic scrape and thud of his tools and his own ragged breathing. At night, he would sit by his meager fire, eating beans from a can, his body aching with a profound weariness. But in his mind, he saw it. He saw green leaves in the darkness. He saw the blush of a ripening peach. He saw Martha's smile. And so, the next morning, he would pick up his tools and descend back into the earth, one shovelful at a time, digging his way toward a memory. A tunnel was one thing, a garden was another. An underground space was dark and could flood. He knew this. The problems were monumental, but his thinking had been sharpened by solitude and singular purpose. For light, the most crucial element, he did not dig one hole, but many. Along the crest of the hill, directly above the main chamber he had hollowed out, he excavated a series of deep, narrow shafts. These were not simple holes. He angled them precisely, following the calculations he had made during his sun-watching, to catch the low winter sun for the maximum number of hours each day. The true genius, however, was in what he did with them. He spent weeks hammering sheets of tin into smooth, polished reflectors. He carefully lowered these into the shafts, securing them against the earthen walls, creating a series of mirrors that would catch the pale sunlight and bounce it downwards, from one reflector to the next, until it illuminated the cavern floor in pools of soft, diffused light. It wasn't bright, not like the full glare of a summer day, but it was life-giving. For water, he designed a system of catchment. He dug a wide, shallow cistern near the tunnel entrance, lining it with packed clay until it was watertight. From this cistern, he carved a narrow, covered channel that sloped gently downwards, deep into the main chamber. Here, it fed a network of smaller irrigation trenches he had carefully dug between the long, raised beds of topsoil he had carried in bucket by bucket. Rain and melting snow would fill the cistern, and a simple wooden sluice gate, which he could operate from inside the tunnel, would allow him to control the flow, giving his future plants a drink whenever they needed it. The town saw only the growing dirt pile and the strange glinting from the holes on the hill. They called it his madness. They couldn't comprehend the complex, living system he was building beneath their feet, a self-contained world designed to defy the very season that ruled their lives. With the systems in place, the time came for planting. He had used the last of his savings, before his credit was cut off, to order the saplings and vines. They arrived shriveled and dormant, looking more like dead sticks than future life. He transported them with the tenderness of a father carrying a newborn. Down in the soft light of the main chamber, he worked the rich topsoil he had painstakingly hauled inside, mixing it with lime and sand until it was perfect. He planted the apple and peach saplings in the deepest beds, their roots spreading out in the cool, dark earth. He planted the grapevines near the earthen walls, knowing they would climb. And in the warmest, best-lit corner, he planted the 2 small orange trees he had paid a fortune for, a foolish, hopeful extravagance in memory of a story Martha had once read to him. He then covered the entrance not with a door, but with a thick, heavy curtain of stitched-together canvas and hides, creating an airlock of sorts to keep the precious warmth inside. It was shortly after this that Sheriff Brody made his final visit. He stood by the strange entrance, his face grim. "Corbin," he'd said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "This has gone on long enough. People are talking. It's an embarrassment. Abandon this foolishness. Come back to town. We'll find you work." Corbin had just looked at him, his face smudged with dirt, his eyes clear. "I am home, Sheriff." The sheriff shook his head and turned away. "Don't come asking for help when the snow flies. The town's charity has its limits." Just a week later, the snow began to fall. It wasn't the gentle, picturesque snow of storybooks. It was a hard, driving snow, born on a relentless wind that howled down from the north. It fell for a day, and then another. It did not stop. The sky turned a permanent, bruised shade of grey, and the world disappeared under a blanket of white that grew deeper and more menacing with every passing hour. The first month of the storm was a novelty. The town of Prosperity huddled indoors, confident in their well-stocked larders and woodpiles. They had seen bad winters before. They were pioneers, hardened by the land. They told stories by the fire, played cards, and felt a smug sense of security. But the snow did not relent. It buried fences, then sheds, then the lower windows of their houses. The wind sculpted it into immense, impassable drifts. The weekly supply run from the east became impossible. The town was an island in a sea of white. By the second month, the confidence had curdled into a quiet, gnawing anxiety. The general store's inventory dwindled alarmingly. Flour, then sugar, then salted meat began to be rationed. The woodpiles, once so reassuringly high, shrank with terrifying speed. The cold was a physical predator. It seeped through the walls of their homes, leached the warmth from their bodies, and left a brittle frost on the inside of the window panes. Then came the sickness. It started as a cough, a persistent weariness that settled deep in the bones. They called it winter lung. But then other symptoms appeared. Gums grew soft and bled. Old wounds, long healed, began to ache and even reopen. A profound listlessness fell over the town, a lethargy that was more than just cabin fever. Dr. Adams, a man of science and reason, began to see a terrifying pattern he recognized from his old medical texts. It was scurvy. A disease of sailors and explorers, a sickness born from the absence of life in their diet. Their stored food, salted, dried, preserved, was keeping them from starving, but it was not keeping them alive. It was a slow, creeping death, a decay from within, brought on by a winter that had no end in sight. The town of Prosperity was dying, and they didn't even have the strength to be afraid anymore. The breaking point came in the form of a little girl, the store owner's daughter, Lizzie. Her small body was racked with a fever that wouldn't break, and her breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper. Dr. Adams stood over her small bed, his face a mask of helpless frustration. He had done everything he could. He had exhausted his meager supply of medicines. He looked at the girl's pale face, the purple tinge to her lips, and knew the truth. He turned to the sheriff and the girl's father, who stood waiting in the cold parlor. "It's not the fever that's killing her," the doctor said, his voice heavy. "It's the weakness. Her body has nothing left to fight with. We are all depleted." He ran a hand over his tired face. "I need fruit. Or fresh greens. Anything with the life of the sun in it. Without it, she won't last the week. And she will be the first of many." The words hung in the air, cold and sharp as icicles. The store owner wept silently. Sheriff Brody stared out the window at the endless, churning white. He felt the full weight of his responsibility, of his certainty, of his arrogance. He had assured the town they were prepared. He had mocked the one man who had tried to prepare for something worse. The memory of Corbin, his face calm and resolute, returned to him. He remembered the warning, spoken so quietly but now screaming in his mind, "Nature keeps its own ledger." The bill had come due, and the price was the life of a child. "The tunnel rat," the sheriff said, his voice barely a whisper. The doctor looked at him, confused. "Corbin," Brody clarified, his gaze meeting the doctor's. "His mad project. His tunnels." A desperate, impossible flicker of hope ignited in the doctor's eyes. It was insane. It was a fool's errand. But it was the only errand they had left. "Get your coat," the sheriff said to the doctor. "We're going for a walk." The journey to Corbin's ranch was a pilgrimage of penitence. The two men, heads bowed against the biting wind, trudged through snow that was waist-deep in places. The world was a monochrome nightmare of white and grey, the silence broken only by their own labored breathing and the shrieking of the wind. It took them 3 hours to cover the distance a horse could have walked in 30 minutes. When they finally saw the ranch, it was almost completely buried. Only the peak of the roof and the top of the stone chimney were visible above the snow. But there was a thin plume of smoke rising from the chimney, a fragile grey ribbon against the oppressive sky. And there was a narrow, cleared path, a trench dug through the snow, leading from the house to the base of the hill where the great mound of earth lay. They found Corbin at the entrance to his tunnel, clearing away the freshly fallen snow. He looked up as they approached, his expression unreadable. He was thinner, his face etched with the lines of hard labor, but his eyes were clear and steady. He held his shovel like a sentinel guarding a gate. "Sheriff," he said, his voice flat. Dr. O'Sheriff Brody didn't waste time with pleasantries. He was a man stripped of his pride, left with nothing but raw, desperate need. "Corbin," he began, his words coming out in puffs of white mist. "We were wrong. I was wrong. We need your help," he explained the sickness, the dwindling supplies, the little girl dying in her bed. He laid the town's failure bare before the man they had scorned. Corbin listened without interruption, his gaze never wavering. When the sheriff finished, a long silence stretched between them, filled only by the wind. Then, Corbin nodded once, a short, sharp gesture. "Wait here." He disappeared behind the heavy canvas flap. A moment later, he emerged, holding a lantern. "Come," he said. "See what a fool has been doing with his time." He led them down into the darkness. After the blinding white of the snow, the tunnel was a shock, a descent into the quiet, cool belly of the earth. The air was still and smelled of damp soil and something else, something green and alive. The lantern cast flickering shadows on the smooth, earthen walls. They walked for what felt like 100 yards before the narrow tunnel opened into a vast chamber. And they stopped, breathless. It was impossible. The air here was warm and humid, a stark contrast to the Arctic chill outside. And it was filled with life. In the soft, glowing pools of light from the shafts above, rows upon rows of green plants thrived. Grapevines, heavy with small, tight clusters of purple fruit, climbed the walls. Peach and apple saplings, though small, had leaves and the beginnings of tiny buds. And in the warmest corner, on 2 small, miraculous trees, hung a dozen globes of brilliant orange. The doctor let out an audible gasp. He walked forward as if in a trance and gently touched a leaf on a vine, half expecting it to be an illusion. He looked at Corbin, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief. How was all he could manage? "The earth is warm," Corbin said simply, his voice echoing slightly in the chamber. "And the sun still shines, if you know how to catch it." The sheriff could not speak. He looked at the impossible harvest, the result of one man's grief, obsession, and ingenuity. He saw not just food, but a profound rebuke of his own short-sightedness. Corbin walked over to one of the orange trees and carefully twisted an orange from its stem. He handed it to the doctor. "This will have the most sunlight in it," he said. "Take it for the girl. I will pack a basket with grapes and apples. It will be enough for now." He looked from the doctor to the sheriff. "But you will need to help me harvest the rest. And everyone will need to learn the work. This winter is not over." Corbin and the sheriff returned to the town not as an outcast and a leader, but as partners in a desperate mission of salvation. Corbin carried a large wicker basket laden with the impossible fruit, its vibrant colors a stark defiance of the white world around them. As they walked into the center of town, people emerged from their homes, their faces pale and gaunt. They saw the basket, and a stunned silence fell over the small crowd. They stared at the deep purple of the grapes, the pale green of the apples, the impossible, shocking orange of the fruit on top. They looked from the basket to Corbin, the man they had mocked, the man they had called tunnel rat. There was no mockery in their eyes now. There was only a profound, humbling shame. Corbin walked directly to the doctor's house and handed the basket over. He said nothing. He did not need to. The doctor took the orange and disappeared inside. The rest of the town just watched Corbin, their silence a confession. It was Sheriff Brody who broke it. He stood on the steps of the Mercantile, the place where the town's judgment had been so coldly passed, and he spoke. His voice was raw, but it carried over the snow-muffled street. "We called this man a fool," he began, his eyes scanning the faces of his people. "We laughed at him. We called him tunnel rat." He paused, letting the weight of the name hang in the air. "We were wrong. We put our faith in our high walls and our full larders, and we scorned a man who was looking deeper. He tried to warn me. He told me, nature keeps its own ledger, and the bill always comes due today. That bill was delivered to Liz's bedside. And this man, this good man whom we exiled with our cruelty, is the one who has paid it for us. He looked directly at Corbin. There are no words, Corbin. Only deeds. We are ready to learn the work. From that day forward, the town of Prosperity labored alongside their savior. They learned to haul dirt, to tend the vines, and to harvest the precious fruit, their shared work a long, unspoken apology written in sweat and soil, deep beneath the frozen ground.